Why do the ancients stay stagnant for several thousand years? In other words, there is no economic movement. You think, oh, we'd figure this out, we'd figure that out. In the course of, not just, my life, but in the course of the last few centuries, in the course of, say, the United States existing as a country, our standard of living is multiplied several-fold. In the whole of ancient times, there was no increase in standard of living. There was no improvement. There was no gaining. And part of that first was the idea of the state being God, the state being a little g God, and the state believing, the rule of the state. The absolute rule says, everything belongs to me. I should feel good. It should be great. Like, have you ever seen, for us older people, the Ten Commandments? Or for you, younger people, which is also a good movie, The Prince of Egypt. What do you see? How the Pharaoh's living. They've got these beautiful palaces built. You can go and look at the pyramids. You know what the pyramids are? Tombs. In other words, think about it. A nation of a few million people spent all of their resources building a tomb. So everything that could be invested to expand, develop, improve, no, what are we doing? The state is squeezing it all out so the state can live better, so the king can have an opulent life. So it can look like the king is a wonderful and masterful creature who rules over everything, and he or she is doing fantastic. But what are they doing? They're squeezing the nation into, poverty. But see, those who rule don't care, because as long as they live well, it doesn't matter about. And this concept penetrates faux pas we've seen in the United States and other countries in which modern thing, gas prices have gone up in many parts of the United States, hitting over $5 a gallon. And you've got, comedians going, oh, I have a Tesla, it doesn't matter. Or worse, high government officials saying, well, they should just get an electric car. Oh, well, are they going to front me the $50,000, $60,000 for it? What are they doing? They're dismissing the impact of their policies on who? On the peasantry. And that is something that goes back to the ancients, when those who rule thought what they were doing was so great. Oh, they're these little these deities, these little deities who rule over the peasants, and the peasants should just be happy with what they have and content. They shouldn't be so selfish. In fact, with this, the Chinese have a mentality, an old saying that says peasants. And it tells you how they thought of regular people. So the government is the God. The government should live well. The king, ruler should live well. How do they think of the people? The Chinese have an old saying, peasants like sesame seeds. You can always squeeze them and get more oil. Think of the impact of how these ancient civilizations viewed their population when that was a common phrase cutting across all. The only two exceptions you do not see that common phrase in, or three I should say, are the ancient Hebrews, because the king couldn't be God. In fact, they warned about that. The ancient Greeks, in which the polis, the citizens, had some rights, and the ancient Romans, before they become the empire again, in which citizens have rights. But even later with the Greeks and Romans, that comes in. That comes in because the vanity of men to do that. But what it does to us today is when we look at the ancients, we make the mistake of looking at them and saying what? Oh, look at the size of the pyramids. Egypt was wealthy. Look at the size of the Pantheon. These places. Well, wait a minute. How'd they build these things? They squeezed everything out so they could build this. So the common people were living poor. In fact, you can see this in the way even they treated combat. When the Persian Empire invades Greece, an empire of almost 50 million people is invading a cluster of city-states. Now, the reason I use conflicts or wars occasionally with other items is because oftentimes ancients would say, you lost the favor of gods in a war. The reason I use it is because in a war, it's the only way governments really pay for their failure is, oh, I totally boloed. Someone invaded my country and conquered it. Because a lot of times, the government's going to be squeezing people forever. The governments don't care because they're living well. The God King is living well. He's not worried about how the peasants are doing. And where you can see an example of this, when the Persian Empire invades Greece, when they storm into Greece, the Persian troops, because the Cheapness. I was going to say pusillanimity, but I never quite say that word right. It's one of those 5-syllable words. But because of the cheapness of the Persian kings, they sent an army of around 250,000 men. But they were basically fighting. Imagine fighting a battle in close up and personal. You're wearing something basically, a tunic, like your A1 shirt today. This is what's going to protect me. Kind of reminds me of Mulan. This medallion will protect me. And then the guy punches in the face. Doesn't work. They use a wicker shield. In other words, a shield that would, if they were, wicker, if they were lucky, maybe made out of leather. Because the only thing they might have that would be metal would be your weapon, so you could kill somebody. And a weapon could be picked up by the other guy and they could recycle them. Whereas, shields and armor, they could get broken, so they went cheap. The Greeks were fighting for their independence, their lives, their freedom. They wore what? They wore breastplates. They wore, upper leg guards. They wore shin guards. They had this big yard-wide shield. They wore helmets. Okay, well, what happens in these 2-4? So the Greeks, they individually spend money on their own equipment because it means they're alive. They're not draftees dragged up for the empire so the empire can feel good. They're individual citizens who say, we're going to team up and work together and form a unit, a military unit, because we're protecting what? We're protecting our homes. So when these two items clash, it shows you the value of human lives. In a democratic or a system which individuals are valued, they have armor, protection, shielding. And they're running up against a despotic system that believes people's lives can be burnt and wasted like water. And so what happens? The Greeks, that's why we had the whole tale. People always wonder, the 300 Spartans, how do the Spartans hold out against what was a narrow pass? Still, if I can throw bodies at you, and we're doing hand-to-hand fighting here, we're not sniping or having giant breastworks, we're doing what? Big fortifications. It's up close and personal. Well, it's simple. Think about it. If I'm wearing armor, it's hard for you to get me, and I got guys next to me, and we're defending each other. We're a unit. And you're coming after me, and you've got a shirt on and a wicker shield, which if I've got a nice heavy sword, it's going right through that wicker shield and right through your clothes, right in you. Because what is it? Your system doesn't care if you live. And this is something we see in the modern day, which we will get to in later parts of this course, but I'm going to mention now, in the way the Soviet Union, communist states, treated their soldiers. They fed them in to a meat grinder, like the ancient Persians did, because the glory of the state, the glory of the cause, meant sacrificing anybody. That's why we'll take an extreme example. In the Korean War, and this is like the Persians versus the Greeks, in the same situation. The communist Chinese fed their men into meat grinders, and they had a 70-to-1 kill ratio. So for every American who died, the Chinese lost about 70. Think about that ratio. It tells you. Now, keep in mind, this is communism. Theoretically, we were dedicated to raising the peasant worker classes so they can live well and they can move forward. But they did what? They fed them because, in other words, the peasants they're disposable. The revolution is all. They should be willing to die for the revolution. It's like with the Persians. They did what? They fed their men in because, they should be willing to die for Emperor Xerxes because, he is the Lord of everything he surveys, and they should be willing to go. And so what they did, in other words, their lives were disposable. They meant nothing because the greater cause. So there was no value on individual life. There was no value on human beings meant. The development of the individual, of value, is something that comes a little later. That develops. So it starts with the ancient Hebrews, with the Greeks. The idea that an individual has worth beyond the state. Think about how radical that is, that an individual has worth in the eyes of God. And that's going to have a major economic impact because most of what we call economic development will come from the development of the firm and the individual both having rights, being allowed to exist and develop and improve themselves. See, before you get that, it's the state extracts all, and they just exist for the glory of the state, the glory of the God King. And so when you go back to the ancients and you have the Chinese emperors and the Persian emperors and the Egyptian pharaohs, And you go to the modern day and you have Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin and Vladimir Lenin. They're all the same creature. They are the embodiment of the state, and everything in the nation exists for their glory to achieve what they believe is their purpose. And it's pure extraction. No creation, no building. But when you get to the Hebrews, and I love this item from the ancient Hebrews. Let me just click. But it's from Samuel. And when the Hebrews said, give us a king. Give us a king. And he goes, why do you want a king? You have the Lord, and you have the judges who answer the Lord, and they're constrained by the laws of God. Why do you want a king? Well, everyone else has a king. We should have one. Glory to our nation. People see this and show the wealth of our nations. And he warns them. He warns them. He will take your sons for his soldiers to use in his wars, for his glory. He will take your daughters to be his servants and concubines, for his glory. He will tax your property and all you have to make himself rich, for his glory. And he goes, do you still want a king? They go, yes. And this is where the prophet's going, And this is something that reoccurs because people think the glory of the state means we are doing well. Let me finish off on this little one, which comparison. The United States, by every criteria, is the world's richest country in terms of size, power, everything. The White House is about 170th ranked size. In other words, 170 other countries, chief executives, have a building greater than the White House. Why? It's because the American people do not want our president thinking he is greater than the people he rules. He might be, okay, he's the president, should be maybe look a little better, but just a little. In other countries, you can go to the palaces, so many countries that are just ridiculously poor, destitute, broken, and their rulers have these giant palaces. The executive office, in fact, that's why in 9/11, when the terrorists were looking for the White House, they were looking at it from the way people look from their country. The rulers live in the biggest building. And so they were flying around Washington trying to find the White House, and they couldn't see it. Because from the air, it's actually very small. And they'd see that little white building and say, that can't be it. It's the rule of this great country. It's going to be like, 500 feet tall and, this much wide. It's that building bigger. What held them in constraint? Would politicians love to live in that? Sure. Look at politicians. They all have egos and think they're wonderful. And I don't care which one you like or dislike. It's a weakness of the creature. But the system constrains them, the value of the individual. And so this is the point Samuel was warning about, because when they get kings, one of the first things the kings in Israel do is, enrich themselves and turn away from the Lord. Because think about when you're a king, you like the fact that people worship you and they're beneath you. But then there's somebody above you imposing rules. So they get rid of God because, God says you can't do things. But see, when they're their own God, and this goes back to despotic, I want to be like the despotic kings. I am my own God. I can rule the people. What do? The first power they have is to treat other people like dirt. To show that you are God, you can kill people or take all they have or make them live in misery. Because why? It makes you feel good. It shows how powerful you are. And that creates and generates poverty. That drives people down. And so when I mention this thing, when the Greeks conquered the Persians, Alexander gets full of himself. Think about how many places he named. We know of Alexandria in Egypt, named after Alexander. He made 20 or 30 cities all across the Persian Empire he conquered, calling them Alexandria. There's Alexandria here, Alexandria there. Alexandria on the Tiberias. Alexander was in Alexandria in Afghanistan. Think of all the resources, not just the lives of his troops, which was waste, but all the resources he did for his own aggrandizement. I'm not saying he wasn't brilliant. I'm not saying he wasn't capable and a fantastic general. What I'm saying is the fact of many people who are given gifts, he looks in the mirror and says, I am wonderful, and he acts like the despotic Persians the Greeks so hated. And he becomes a despotic monarch, much like the ones the Greeks had resisted. He became that creature the Greeks had so hated because it fulfilled his ego, his vanity.